Few things are as iconic of youthful adventure and exploration as old train tracks. It seems like human nature to follow them in one direction when you stumble upon an endless line of railroad tracks. But sometimes terrible things happen at these places. Trauma, horror, and even death. What you're about to hear are allegedly true and scary stories that take place on and around the railroad. Enjoy, and be sure to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear stories about small towns, Yosemite National Park, and scary things you've seen at your job. Check out my shows Freaky Folklore and the Darkness Prevails podcast on your favorite podcasting apps like Spotify and iTunes. Now, let's begin. My Grandpa's Story from EstablishedOne. My grandpa shared a story with me when I was little, a story that I tried to never bring up again. The pained look on his face when he shared it with me the first time told me this was something that he dreaded to talk about, and so I've avoided the topic. But I'll share it with you because of how disturbing it was. My grandpa grew up in the 50s in the South. He still lives in the same home he grew up in as well, a tiny little suburban home, but it wasn't always suburbs. Back when he was 8 or 9 years old, it was mostly woods and a couple of dirt roads that led to a distant town. There was one particular man-made landmark he lived near to that he and his best friend would always meet up at and play. Their favorite games included balancing on the rails to see who had better balancing skills, playing hide-and-seek in the nearby woods, throwing rocks at the trees from the tracks to see who had the best aim. Now, he and his best friend, Alexander, had never once seen or heard a train go through on these tracks. For the last year or so that they'd been playing there, they assumed the tracks were decommissioned or unused. Even their families thought that. But what their families didn't know for a while was that they were even playing at these tracks. One day, my grandpa and Alexander were balancing on a part of the track that split into two, a railway switch, I think it's called, when my grandpa's uncle just came out of the woods and caught them playing there. This isn't strange, really. My grandpa's uncle hunted all the time, and it was often a primary source of food for them before things in that area got more developed. When he saw two kids playing on the tracks, he immediately ran towards them, shouting to get off. When he made it to the two, who were now standing awkwardly next to the tracks, he gave them a chewing out they would remember. Grandpa says he remembers it clearly. His uncle explained that train tracks were for trains, obviously, and that the junction they were playing on was dangerous in particular. Said if the junction were to activate, if our feet got caught in between the rails, there would be no escaping. He looked them both dead in the eyes, one at a time, and asked them, "Do you want to lose a leg?" The boys apologized, saying no. Of course they didn't want to be amputees for the rest of their lives. After that, my uncle led the two boys back to my grandpa's house, in awkward silence. But remember, kids are kids, and doing what they're told is often a rarity among certain children. My grandpa didn't care much about what his uncle had to say. He wasn't scared of getting hurt, but what he didn't like was being lectured. Made him feel embarrassed, and that was the sole reason that he didn't go back to the tracks for a long time. Alexander, on the other hand, continued to go. Alexander had a rough upbringing. Now, he and my grandpa's family were very much poor, but Alexander's family was a bit rough. My grandpa always knew that Alexander's dad was abusive, and his mom liked to drink. So the railroad tracks weren't necessarily fascinating to him, but he kept going back after my grandpa's uncle's warning, because it was a place he knew where he could escape, a place he knew he wouldn't be beaten by his dad or be constantly told by his mom that she wished he was never born. This was probably the origin of one of Grandpa's favorite phrases when watching reality TV. "Some folks just shouldn't be parents," he would say. And after hearing this story, it makes sense why. Anyway, the next time my grandpa saw Alexander, it was at school, and his lip was busted open, one of his eyes swollen up all gray and purple. It made Grandpa so mad. But what could he do as a child? He couldn't just walk to Alexander's house and tell his dad and mom what he thought of them. But my grandpa was amazed at the fact that the teacher never did anything. Couldn't she tell the cops? Sure, it was a small town, only had a handful of officers, but surely someone could have done something. But they never did. And to this day, Grandpa still doesn't know why. And when Alexander began not showing up to school at all anymore, he knew exactly who to blame: the two people who birthed the poor boy. After weeks of not seeing his friend anymore, Grandpa was fed up. Alexander was the only other person in the world he had to talk to that was his age, the only other friend he had. He didn't get along with his other schoolmates, and so confronting Alexander's parents became more and more of a good idea to him. One day after school, he went through with it. He walked 4 miles to Alexander's house. He had done this before, so it was no big deal at the time. The closer he got, the more scared he was, but thoughts of Alexander in his head pushed him forward. Soon he was knocking at the door. A lazily slurred, "It's open," came from within. Swallowing hard, my grandpa hesitantly opened the door. There sat Alexander's dad on a recliner, all broken down and permanently reclined. The man didn't even look at him as he walked in. Alexander's mother was collapsed and blacked out on the couch, which was covered in holes. My grandpa demanded to know where Alexander was, why he hadn't been to school for so long. The dad rolled his head to the side, leering at my grandpa, and said, "Who gives a damn?" Then he rolled his head back around, continuing to watch TV. My grandpa was flabbergasted. Did they not know where their son was? If that was the case, they didn't even care? What kind of people were they? My grandpa left, sneaking around to Alexander's room, looking in the window, but there was no sign of him. So my grandpa ran off, looking in the last place he could think of, the railroad. He made it to the tracks, but didn't see him just yet. He began to walk along them, keeping an eye out for his best friend. Soon he saw something in the distance. He didn't know what it was. It seemed to be near the railway switch or junction part of the tracks. The sun was beginning to go down by then, but if this was a clue as to the whereabouts of his friend, my grandpa would keep going. The closer and closer he got to this object, the more his stomach sank. And before he knew it, he realized and recognized what he was looking at. One of my best friend's shoes, and it was still attached to a leg. My grandpa said he screamed and cried and ran all the way home. He told his parents, and he led them to what he found. It was Alexander's leg, and as far as he knows, they never found the rest of Alexander. My grandpa believes that Alexander continued to escape from his home life, going to the train tracks, hoping that my grandpa would come to join him, but he came too late. And one day, he got his leg caught in between the rails, and you can probably guess what happened next, because it turns out that railroad track was active. It was just rarely used. If any kids are out there listening now, playing on the railroad tracks is a bad idea. Be wary of them, and never abandon your best friends. Something walking the tracks. From Allie. I found this website when I heard my husband listening to some of the stories online. I had grandparents who always claimed to have seen things. I used to ask them to tell their scary stories at night, before I went to bed. Many of these stories they would tell me were of things they had seen, or stories their parents told them as a child. I had grandparents who never lied about anything, so I never had a reason not to believe that everything they told me was true. The story I've heard the most was one my papa would tell me about his father and the man he saw on the railroad tracks. My great-grandfather was walking home from work one day and had just passed the railroad tracks not far from home. The tracks ran through right beside the road he was walking. If you stepped up onto the tracks, you could look down and follow an embankment down to the edge of the river. My grandfather had walked this road many times and had never seen anything unusual. On this particular day, he had a strange feeling that something or someone was there with him. Once he got to the tracks and began walking along them, he heard footsteps that sounded like they were coming up the embankment. It was a rough terrain to come up, and he stopped. He listened for whoever it was. As he stood there, the crunching got closer to the top of the tracks. A man finally appeared and stopped to stand at the top of the tracks. My grandfather described this man as being very skinny, almost bone-like, and his face was pale white and sunken in with black, hollow eyes. He described this man as looking sickly, or not even human. The man stood there looking at my grandfather for a minute, then spoke. He had a deep, shaky voice. He looked at my grandfather and said,
"If you follow me down this bank to the river, you will never work again."
My grandfather stood there for a moment, then asked, "What's down there?" The skeleton-like man simply repeated,
"If you follow me down this bank to the river, you will never work again."
A second time, my grandfather asked, "Why should I follow you? What's down at the river?" The man, after a short time, spoke again.
"If you follow me down this bank to the river, you will never work again. You will find everything you will ever need."
This time, after the man spoke, my grandfather decided to refuse. "No," he said. "I'm just going to go home." After hearing this, the man on the tracks simply turned and began to walk away. One last time, as the man walked away, my grandfather heard,
"Any man who comes down to the river will never have to work again."
My grandfather left and finished his walk home. Many times after that, my grandfather would walk that same road and would wonder about what he saw and heard. But the man never appeared to him again. Nothing was ever found at the river to anyone's knowledge. I used to ask my papa what the man may have wanted. He would always joke and say maybe a fortune of money, and we would be wealthy. When my mother heard the story, she said my grandfather was smart not to follow the man. He could have walked to the river and died. She would say, "You won't work if you're dead." What the man meant that day, we will never know. Whether he was trying to lead my grandfather to a fortune or trick him into death is still a mystery. Why the man was never seen again is also unknown. Either way, there is some reason that man was on the tracks that day and chose to confront my grandfather. Maybe there are others who have seen or heard something similar. Thank you for listening. The Train Yard. From Daryl. Location, Silvis, Illinois. This event took place in October of 2006. I work for the NRE, or the National Railroad Equipment Agency, as a backup janitor when the normal one isn't available. I've seen some very weird things at the places I've cleaned. There's the occasional syringe needles, used condoms, and beer cans. Not that shocking after a while. But the scariest thing I've ever seen was when I was called out to one of our train yards to clean out some disused locomotives. These things hadn't been used since the mid-80s and were going to be sold for scrap as they were too battered to be refurbished. I was warned beforehand that there might be a homeless person in one of them, but I brushed it off since I'd seen many homeless people at the various places I've cleaned, and they usually just ran off when they saw me coming. So I picked up my bucket and got in the company truck to go out to the disused part of the train yard where the abandoned locomotives were. Routine janitorial duties. As I was driving out there, I noticed that I left the keys to the locomotive cabs back at the office. Well, I figure these things are so old that the door might not even be there anymore. So I drive out to the yard and park my truck. Then I get out. Nothing creepy at this point, just some rotting diesel engines. I'd seen much more creepy things before. Anyway, I made my way up the side railing of the locomotive pilot and proceeded to kick in the cab door with little force. It didn't even have a lock on the door. I walk in and I immediately notice something very odd. The inside of the cab was in near mint condition. Great, I think. One less room to clean. But then I noticed something very, very disturbing. A skeleton perched against a wall. At first I thought it was an old Halloween decoration that some kid had left as a prank or something. But then I noticed that it's wearing a leather jacket and clutching a pill bottle in its bony hands. I realized then what I was looking at wasn't an ordinary Halloween decoration. It was the corpse of a man. I slowly walked a bit closer and grabbed the pill bottle from the bony hand. The prescription date was 1096. This guy had been rotting in one of the locomotives for 10 years, and nobody, not even an employee, had noticed his absence. I pressed the button on my radio and told dispatch to call 911. About 5 minutes later, a rail cop car pulls up, and an off-duty cop steps out. He walks up to the locomotive cab. Long story short, it turns out this man had been missing since 1996, and no one cared enough to look for him. He was an elderly man who lost his wife and overdosed himself on one of the locomotives. He lay there dead for 10 years and was somehow never found. To this day, I'll never look at trains the same way ever again. The Train Trestle. From Verde. One day during the summer of 2014, my best friend, his then girlfriend, my then girlfriend, and me were sitting at my house located in a rural community in central southern Illinois. We were all trying to think of something to do, but we were bored out of our minds. We were sharing ideas such as going to the park, going out to eat, going out for a movie, but none of us could really agree on one thing. Then, out of the blue, my then girlfriend softly mentioned walking to the old train trestle, about 1.5 miles or 2 miles away from my home. Now, I had visited the trestle before on multiple occasions, usually just to pass the time with my buddies. But it had been a long time since I'd traveled the distance to throw rocks off the top of the trestle into the creek below, or just drink beer sitting in the trestle tunnel. We'd all eventually decided it wouldn't be a bad idea. After all, the walk there would take about 20 to 30 minutes. Then hanging out for a bit and walking back would definitely give us something to do through the day. Leaving my house, it was about 5:30 p.m. We had to walk down my street for about 300 feet before we turned off into a neighbor's yard and started walking along the edge of the cornfield leading to the railroad tracks. It took us about 15 minutes just to get to the tracks, due to the excessive whining coming from our girlfriends and us having to give them piggyback rides all the way to the tracks. Once we finally made it to the tracks, it had been getting darker and darker. We set out down the tracks toward the trestle, just conversing back and forth about random things. About 5 minutes into the walk, a train was making its way down the tracks, so we all walked off to the side of the tracks, down the steep rocky ditch to keep clear of the train. We were already surrounded by woods. It was getting dark, and my friend and I were growing wary from carrying our girlfriends through the field. As the train passed by, sounding its horn, blocking out all other noises coming from the vehicles in town and the sounds of nature, I stared off into the woods. That's when I saw it. A strange man-like figure standing at the tree line. It was about 100 yards away from where we were all standing, waiting for the train to pass. I caught the attention of the rest of the group when I pointed my index finger towards the figure, and I shouted, "Guys, look over there!" We all stared in the direction of what we decided was a man, and we all grew suspicious. What's he doing out there? Why is he just standing there? About 2 minutes passed, and he turned around and began to head into the woods. Then my friend's girlfriend shouted at him, "Creep!" We all hushed her and told her to keep quiet, but he had already turned back towards us. We all hated her at the moment. We all stared at this man, frightened. Thankfully, he turned back again and walked into the woods. We thought it was the last we would see of him, so we continued down the tracks, aiming to get to the trestle with the small amount of daylight that remained. As we walked, I had heard the sound of leaves being crushed and twigs being snapped, so I halted my friends and told them to stay quiet. They could all hear the sounds as well. "Probably a rodent," my friend said. He picked up a few rocks from the ditch and chucked them in the direction of which the sounds were coming. We heard the first rock hit the ground, then the second, but never the third. I had watched him hurl the third rock into the woods, and he was a pitcher for our baseball team, so it had some power behind it. We were all shocked to hear dead silence after he threw it, and not even 15 seconds later, I saw the same rock flying through the air right back at my friend. I yelled, "Look out!" and lunged myself into him, pushing him out of the path of the airborne rock. I helped him up, and he took off in the direction that the rock came from. I couldn't let him go alone. I didn't want him to end up hurt or worse. So the both of us were bolting through the woods now, not even considering that the trestle was no more than 50 feet in front of us. Keeping a steady pace, running side by side, we both approached the edge of the trestle rapidly, without seeing that we were nearing the edge of a 25-foot drop-off into the creek. We got closer and closer, and we weren't slowing down. Next thing I knew, I was falling. Luckily for me, I landed about halfway down the hill leading to the creek and trestle tunnel. I rolled down to the bank of the stream. My friend, however, wasn't so lucky. He took the full fall and landed in the water. Fortunately, the creek water was high. Neither of us suffered any major injuries, just a couple of bumps and bruises. Leaving our girlfriends behind, I frantically tried to get up and make my way back, but my friend had just stood there in the water, staring off into the darkness. I didn't know what he was looking at. I tried getting his attention and ended up limping over to him, but once I reached him, I could see what he was looking at. There was a small tent with a hatchet, a bowie knife, and a dead cat lying next to it, We were both horrified and knew that the man we'd seen was settled here. Without any further hesitation, we rushed back up the tracks and to our girlfriends. We wasted no time explaining, grabbing their hands, and sprinting back the way we came. We neared the field. It was surely 8 p.m. by then, almost too dark to see what was in front of us. We would have used our phone flashlights, but my phone was dead. My buddy's didn't work because he landed in the water, and it broke. And both of our girlfriends left theirs at the house because they didn't want them to get wet in the creek. We were more than halfway home with no sight of the man we'd seen. We'd all started to walk when we reached the field because we could see the streetlights and felt a sense of safety. But as we approached my neighbor's yard, I had to turn around for one last look, just to make sure no one was following us. I wish I hadn't, because off in the distance, I saw the seemingly pure white face of a man and the gleam of a streetlight reflecting off of a hatchet blade, motionless. I quickly turned around, didn't say a word to any of my friends, hoping the man hadn't noticed me looking at him, grabbing my girlfriend's hand and making my way to my street. When we'd gotten to my house, I grabbed clothes, a charger, and a pocket knife, and I left with my friends to go stay at my girlfriend's house across town. None of us felt safe being within a 2-mile radius of where we just experienced perhaps the scariest moment of our lives. We haven't been back to the Trestle since, and I don't plan on ever going back. I'm just happy that nothing serious happened to any of us, and we're all still okay to this date. My buddy and I are still best friends, but my girlfriend and I split, and his moved to Michigan. Not because of what happened, though. I still think about it today. What would have happened if me or my friend broke a bone or sprained an ankle when we took the fall? Would we still have been able to get away from there quick enough? We could have both been hurt or even met death if we hadn't been so fortunate. I hope nothing like this ever happens again. I was lucky enough to get out of it the first time, but would I have the same luck twice? Or would I meet my fate at the end of a razor-sharp hatchet blade?